Hi everyone, I've put together this video to act as a supplement to support your search for empirical articles, which is something that you'll have to do at various moments for different assignments in this course. I realize some of you have taken a research methods before, perhaps in your undergraduate course, or you've had to research or find empirical articles for other courses. So you may be more familiar with the process. However, some of you maybe were not able to complete a research methods course due to COVID, or maybe it's been a while since you've been asked to search for a piece of scholarly literature in academic university databases. So what I've done is I put together a presentation and then I'm actually going to walk you through a search. And the presentation is really meant to ground you in some important concepts before you actually begin your search. So if you've read chapters 1 and chapters 3 already from the textbook, then you'll have a bit of background knowledge and awareness about sort of what we mean when we say research. Now, understanding that research is the way we're approaching it in this class is really dependent on, are you conducting a search that is based on a system, right? A systematic approach to answering a question, testing a hypothesis, learning more about people, right? Generating some kind of knowledge by following a systematic approach to collecting data, analyzing data, interpreting data. And so that's different from when we talk about like, oh, I'm going to go research, when my favorite artist is going to be in town, let me go Google it. We use research in that way. We say, I'm going to research something on Google, but that's not the kind of research we're talking about here, right? Because just looking up a term or a person or an event on Google is searching for information, but it's not following a systematic approach to answering a question or testing a hypothesis or learning more about some social phenomenon. So when we talk about research in an academic setting, we're also talking about scholars, scholarship, and the scholarly community. Because when you are at a point where you are trying to find out what is known about a particular topic, for example, if you want to know what has already been researched about children who are hospitalized and how they interact with hospital staff, then you are going to lean on articles, materials, literature that has already been produced by other scholars, right? So you're looking into resources that already exist within a scholarly community, and sometimes we call that scholarship. So those two things are intimately related, research and scholarship. And sometimes I'll say scholarship when what I mean is research. So we can use those terms interchangeably. It's important to note, as you see here on the screen, that all research is not an experiment. And sometimes when we come into research, a research course like this one, we may know just from our courses we took in high school, things we've seen on TV, maybe things you did in your undergraduate, that experiments are rigorous forms of research. And then sometimes I've noticed students call all research studies experiments. Well, experiments are really one very specific type of a systematic approach to answering a question. And it involves some very specific things. And it's really only used when you're trying to establish causality, that A causes B. And most research, especially in the social sciences, in family science, in child development, in child life, in family therapy and counseling and development, education, is not going to be experimental. And we'll talk more about that later. And I think chapter 4 does a good job of describing that as well. So I just want to put that out there, that you're not, when you search for research, you're not only looking for experiments. That's just one type of a research study. So the other thing to keep in mind is that there are many types of scholarly work. Not every article that you read from a journal that looks very scholarly is going to be an empirical article. And because your assignments for this course are to locate an empirical article that uses quantitative data and analyses, and then you're going to do the same thing, find an empirical article that uses qualitative data, and then later on, when you're working on your research proposal, you're going to locate multiple empirical articles. It's important to understand what is meant by empirical. So let me start by talking about what scholarship or research would not be considered empirical. So the first thing is, you might, when you're doing your search, find a really cool article that talks about a topic you care about. It is focused on the population that you want to know more about the variables or the conditions or the factors that you care about. But it's what the researchers have done is they have looked for and collected 10, 20, 100 existing articles that each article reports the findings of an individual study. And then they take those 100 articles or the literature and they compare and contrast the findings. That's called a literature review. Sometimes it's called a systematic review or a scoping review. The key word is review. And then they will generate new insight from comparing and contrasting and sort of synthesizing the individual findings of those 100 articles. It doesn't have to be 100. It could be fewer. It could be more. That's just an example. That is still considered research. That is still considered scholarly. But that particular approach to generating new knowledge, to answering questions, would not be considered empirical because it's not based on direct observation or a collection of data that is considered observable. And I'll get to the observable part in a minute. So literature reviews, no, they do not count as empirical. Something related to a literature review is called a meta-synthesis. If you come upon an article that you also think is great, but it has the words meta-synthesis, it's described as a synthesis at a meta level. What that means is that, similar to the literature review number one, the authors of that paper, we'll call them the researchers, have identified 10, 20, 50, 100, 200 articles about the same topic. And similar to the literature review, what they've done is they've taken the quantitative results of each of those 50 or 100 articles, and they've run a new analysis such that they're taking, for example, the mean or the percentage or some statistic that is reported in each of those findings, and then they're going to run new statistics based on the statistics of 100 articles. All right, so that's what makes it meta. They're analyzing and synthesizing the quantitative information from a large quantity of already existing articles. That's also not considered empirical. So if you come across an article like that, we can't use it. It wouldn't be approved because it's not an empirical article. The other kind of scholarship literature that you might run across are called conceptual or theoretical papers. Often these are the most interesting to read because they're not usually filled with statistical language. If the author if the researcher is a good writer, sometimes they use metaphors to really try to bring into focus some aspect of development or of family life or of therapy and counseling that they're trying to highlight here. But a conceptual or a theoretical paper is not empirical because it does not report on the findings of a study. What it does is it takes theories or frameworks or concepts that have been explored in the scholarly community, and it presents a new way of thinking about a topic. Sometimes it introduces a model. Sometimes it introduces a framework. Sometimes it introduces a new theory. Sometimes it integrates two existing theories. So, for example, a theoretical paper that combines attachment theory with critical race theory, right? And so that would be a new framework that the authors would introduce because they're taking sort of the dyadic, right? Two people, the parent and child sort of focus of attachment theory, and they're either placing it inside or using it to integrate the concepts of critical race theory, which is more systemic in nature, right? Looking at systems of oppression, systems of discrimination, how they're embedded in our different social institutions, family institutions, etc. So that would be an example of a theoretical paper. Also doesn't count as empirical. So if you run into that, we can't use it. The fourth type of scholarly work, and there are more, these are just sort of the main ones that you might run into, is called a content analysis. Now, in some disciplines, a content analysis would be considered empirical. However, because in our course, it's Research Methods in Family Science, we are working with and for people in families or people in community or people in relationships or individuals, right, as they evolve, as they develop. We want the main source of data to come directly from other people, from other human beings. And what a content analysis does is it uses text as the data. So, for example, if you want to, if a researcher is interested in learning how gender is represented in the posters and sort of signage that is found in the lobbies of clinics, of counseling centers, of crisis centers, because they're trying to understand if the way gender is expressed is inclusive or not, right? In these places where people are entering while they're already feeling vulnerable for different reasons, right? Then they would look at the content, they would study the text, and then they would run an analysis. So that is really interesting and really important. But the data are coming from text or images, not people. So if you are reading your abstract and you see that it's describing any one of these four, a literature review, a metasynthesis, a conceptual or theoretical idea, or a content analysis, and that would not count as empirical. Okay. What makes empirical empirical? Number 5, empirical means, and it's a little fuzzy, but if you just sort of take it at face value, empirical means that the article reports the findings of some study, some research study, some systematic approach to inquiry that uses data that were collected by some mode of observation. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky. What is observation? Well, sometimes we think observation means seeing something with your eyes or your other senses, hearing something. So you might think of, an ethnographer going out into a community and recording what she sees in the field. Sure. But there are other ways to collect observable data. If I were to give you a test to assess your IQ, for example, I can watch you take the test, or I can give it to you online and you can take it at home where I'm not actually seeing you with my own eyes. It's still considered empirical because the responses that you're making are reflective of the questions in that assessment, in that test, that are trying to tap into some observable indicator of your intelligence in that example. So in other words, empirical doesn't mean that the researchers have to, with their own eyes or own ears, visually inspect or see the human beings actually responding to a test, an assessment, a questionnaire, etc. It just means that the way the data are collected is tapping into an observable indicator of some kind of variable. Okay, so how can you tell if an article is empirical or not? Well, articles have a particular structure. If your article has a methods section, then, and I'm trying to get to it here on my screen, I think it comes later. If your article has a methods section, there's a very good chance it's empirical. So A literature review is also going to have a methods section. But when you go to the methods section for a literature review, you're going to find that instead of recruiting people for a research study, the authors went into a library database to try to identify 100 articles. That's how you'll know that it's unempirical. But if you're reading your methods section and it says, we recruited 50 adolescents from a crisis center in the Midwest, and then you keep going, and it says, in order to collect our data, we used surveys, assessments, tests, interviews, etc. Then you know, okay, this is an empirical article. But first and foremost, it has to have a method section. If it doesn't have a method section, it is not empirical. If it does have a method section, you're closer, but go and read how it is that they are recruiting their sample of human beings. If it doesn't include human beings, it's not an empirical article. All right. So chapter 3 in your Mertens text, if you haven't already read it, really goes into more detail on how to best find articles in the in existing databases. So please make sure that you read that. Also be aware that there is a difference between primary and secondary data. Primary data are data that the researchers who are writing the articles collect themselves. So if I am interested in systematically researching how students at TWU compare in their resilience, how their resilience compares to students at UNT, then I might send out a survey that you take electronically as a student that asks you questions about resilience and coping. And I would do the same thing to a group of students at UNT. I could do this all electronically. I don't have to see it myself. It's the way the information is being gathered that makes it observable. And then I would collect all that data. I would run my analysis and come to some conclusion. That's primary data, because I, as the researcher or the research team, are collecting that data directly from the human participants. If I have that data, let's say 500 students at TWU respond and 500 students from UNT respond, and now I have 1,000 responses. If I make that data available to other people, other researchers, and they use it and they say, oh, that's really interesting that you found a difference. Let's say TWU students are more resilient. But now we're interested in looking at gender differences. We're not so much interested in the differences between TWU and UNT. We want to combine the responses and look at the differences between students who identify as women versus students who identify as men versus students who identify as gender non-binary, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so now they are taking the data that I've already collected, and they're going to hopefully generate new knowledge from it. It's still research, but now it's research that uses secondary data. Why am I explaining this? Well, if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, it's okay. If you've gotten to the part where you go, okay, I understand what it means to be empirical. I'm going to look for a methods section. But then you're like, I don't know, is this primary or secondary data? I want for you to really try to find an article that uses primary data. However, if for your topic you can only find an empirical article that uses secondary data, that would be okay. It just gets a little trickier when you look at the analysis. Secondary data analyses tend to be a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more complex. So I want you to understand that there is a difference. It's going to tell you in the methods section whether this is primary or secondary data analysis. Really, I prefer that you use primary data for your quantitative articles, but I'm not going to limit you. So just keep that in mind. If you're not sure what it is, you can always reach out to me and I can help you figure that out. Okay, so for the first article that you have to identify, it needs to be quantitative. What does that mean? Well, when you go to the methods section and you look at their measures, their instruments, their surveys, their tests, their interviews, how is that data collected? Is it collected using a scale that quantifies a response? An example is if I'm asking you if on any given day, how sad did you feel? And your responses, your options are a scale that goes from 1 to 5, where 1 is not sad at all and 5 is I felt sad all day, and maybe 3 is I felt moderately sad, I am quantifying your sadness. The measure is, the survey is quantifying your sadness. So it's looking at a variable, a characteristic, a feeling, etc., and attaching a number to it. So that when you have all of your data collected, you as a researcher can then run a quantitative analysis using software usually, to look at means, right, averages or percentages or frequencies or correlations or, much more complex relationships between those different numbers. So that's what we mean by quantitative. So it's important that you really look at the methods section before determining, is this a quantitative article? Later on, you're going to look for qualitative data analyses. So when you're looking for qualitative articles, your measures, your data collection sources and procedures are going to look different. You're not going to see in the methods section a description of a survey that quantifies sadness, for example. Instead, you might find that the researchers are conducting open-ended interviews where they ask people, have you ever been sad? And if so, can you describe that sadness? Because in asking questions that way, a qualitative approach is really trying to find a deeper meaning, the quality or qualities of a phenomenon, of a feeling, an emotion, a value, a belief, etc. So the data looks very different. The data is typically what we call more dense because it can be interviews, it can be video, it can be photography. So, quality versus quantity. We're not saying either one is better. They are different in terms of the kind of data they produce. And so it's important to understand that because you're either going to find a quantitative article for the first quantitative article summary, or later on you're going to find a qualitative article for the second article summary. So yes, that's important. And then mixed methods is what it sounds like. It's a research study that combines quantitative and qualitative methods, but we're not going to be focusing much on that in this course. All right, so I kind of mentioned this earlier, but it's important that you understand that an empirical article typically is going to follow the same structure. It's going to start with an introduction. It's not necessarily going to say this is the introduction, but the first few paragraphs or pages are the introduction, right? You're introducing the issue at hand. And then typically that introduction would also include or transition right into some background, what we call the literature review. So in other words, before the researchers dive into the methods of how they collected data about coping from TWU students and UNT students, they would first introduce the topic of resilience in college students, and then they would give you a brief review of what is already known about coping and resilience in college students. So that's the background. Then you have your methods section, which is what we already talked about. Who, how, the procedures, how are you analyzing these data? And then you have a results section, and then typically a discussion. So one more time, I know I've said this already probably a dozen times, but your article has to have a method section. If it doesn't have a method section, it is not empirical. Just because it has a method section, though, doesn't mean it's empirical. You have to go in there and look and to see, okay, is this primary data? Do the data come from human beings as opposed to from text or content that is not a response from a human being? And lastly, the journal that your article comes from needs to be of a certain quality. And we know that it's of a certain quality if the journal is peer reviewed. And that simply means that when a researcher, a group of researchers submits their report, their study report to a journal, the journal has a very structured procedure for reviewing and assessing as to whether the study has met the standards of quality for conducting a research study. Okay, so When you start searching for your article, quantitative or qualitative, it's important to know what your search terms are going to be. So most of you already have an idea of who you want to study. You wrote that in your first discussion board. Some of you are interested in studying children, some of you are interested in studying adults, some of you are interested in studying couples, etc. So the more specific you can be about that population, the better. Most of you also have a sense of what variables you are interested in studying. So for example, how children who are hospitalized, how they leverage technology as part of their coping. That the technology aspect would be a variable, right? Because whether or not a child leverages technology, how much time they spend leveraging technology, those dimensions of technology vary. And you're interested in knowing, as these things vary, how might that impact coping? So that leads us to the next question, which is the how. This is a little bit harder to kind of pinpoint, and you may not have an answer for the how yet. And so what do I mean by how? So if you have the who and the what, eventually you want to get to an awareness, an articulation of how you think or how two variables are related, because the how is going to be the heart of the study. So if we're talking about children who are hospitalized, leveraging technology for coping, then are you interested in the relationship, like the correlation between time spent leveraging technology and the building of coping skills? Are you interested in differences? Are there differences in coping between children who are hospitalized who don't use technology versus children who are hospitalized who do? Are you just interested in describing characteristics of children who leverage technology while they're hospitalized because not much is known? Or is there an intervention? Like, is there an app that you have created or someone has created that teaches children how to think about, that helps children build coping skills? So then you'd want to test, is this an effective app for building coping skills? So the how is taking your population, the who and the what, and then trying to determine, okay, how do I theorize? How do I believe that these things are functioning? And you may not know that yet because you're still, depending on where you are in the program, learning theory and reading about other articles. But that is going to be a huge part of your study. And you're going to see it in the articles that you find as well, because each one of those studies, even if they look at the same variables in the same population, the how is going to be different. So pay attention to that as well. All right, so in your Canvas module, in your Canvas site, under the tab that's called modules, you've got a list of resources for helping you begin your search. So if you haven't looked at those, I'm going to show you a screenshot here in a minute. Please make sure that you spend some time, and then I'm going to also walk you through an example. And just before we go, I just have here on the screen an example of a search that is not real good because it's a little too broad. So let's say you're interested in learning more about Latino male adolescents and their mental health. So you just pop in Latino male adolescents and mental health. Well, it's pretty broad. And, a search like that could bring up an article that is economic, looking at the costs associated with public health spending that's associated with Latino male adolescents and suicide attempts, for example. So while that's really interesting, you may not want to choose that article because it's an economic journal, a journal that looks at the economic impacts of a public health issue. And, if you are, for example, in counseling and development, while the economics are important to understand and super interesting, it's too far removed from your discipline, right? So a better set of search terms might be Latino male adolescents and depression. If you want to get specific, you can also just leave it broad, or you can put depression and anxiety and parent support. This because the parent support part is now getting at the how. So maybe you're interested in, okay, does depression among Latino male adolescents vary depending on the levels of parent support, right? So you might think if there's low parent support, then depression tends to be higher. If there's high parent support, then depression tends to be lower. That might be what you hypothesize. You might search this, and then you would come up with a series of articles. So going back to what I said earlier about Canvas, on the left in your Canvas site, you've got all your different navigation tabs. If you click on modules and you scroll down to the middle of the page where it says to search for scholarly journal articles, these sort of first three links here are really useful, especially if you've never done a search for an empirical article using our library database. Okay, so I am going to pivot now to the browser, and not that. Okay. So I have here, I opened up Google Chrome earlier, and I went to the TWU Libraries homepage. It's twu.edu/library, and then another slash. You don't have to remember that. You could just Google TWU Library, and it's the first item that will show up. Okay, so most people, when they come to this page, they go, look, a search bar, search with TW Universal. And they put in, their search terms, Latino, male, adolescents, etc. So what the librarians at TW explained to me is that this search function right here was really created for undergraduates. So an undergraduate student, let's say they're coming straight from high school, or they're transferring from another college, a community college, and they haven't ever really had much exposure to research articles, empirical literature. They're not familiar with any of the scholarly journals in their field. And they would come here and they would put in a search term, and that would, open up a world of possibilities. Well, that's fine for some undergraduate courses, but at the master's and doctoral level, we really should be employing a much more targeted search. So if you have a specific article in mind and you just can't access it, you can put in the title of your article here, and then this search feature is kind of like a Google feature. And so if the title pops up anywhere, you might be able to access the full text article more easily that way. But if you don't have an article in mind or a specific journal, then what you want to do when you get to this page is go to subject guides. So it's the third tab in that banner across. So I'm going to click on subject guides, and I'm going to type in, or I'm going to choose from this pull down menu, family science. Now, I know that sounds outdated, and it is, because we're not the Department of Family Science anymore. We're the Department of Human Development, Family Studies, and Counseling. But they haven't updated the name, so you can just type on family science. Then from here, you're going to say go. And you're going to go, and it's going to bring you to this page. And if you haven't met Andy Tucker, he's our wonderful TWU librarian who is assigned to our department. So then once you are here, underneath this feature that says subjects, you have the option to look at guides, or you have the option to look at databases. So I'm going to go into databases. And here, what Andy Tucker has done is he's created links for sort of the most, what he considers to be the better databases, meaning they tend to get used more, students and users report more successful results. Okay, so you can see that there's a lot of, these are sort of like the top 5: Academic Search Complete, Family and Society Studies Worldwide, Family Studies Abstracts, PsycInfo, Social Index with full text, and then there's additional ones down here that maybe are not as highly ranked. So I'm just going to choose the first one, Academic Search Complete. You have to log in with your TWU ID, and then I'm going to put in some search terms, okay? So basing it off the example I gave a minute ago, I am interested in learning more about Latino adolescents, kind of their mental health, their depression and anxiety, and levels of parent support. So I am going to start with my who, right? Latino adolescents. And if you're not sure, male adolescents, female adolescents, you can leave this kind of broad because sometimes you'll find a study that combines both, but reports on the findings of each gender. Now, for something like Latino adolescent, researchers may use a different term. They may use Latinx, Latina, they might use Hispanic, they might be more specific. They might say Cuban adolescents, Mexican American adolescents, Puerto Rican adolescents, etc. So just to make sure I don't miss anything, I'm also going to put Hispanic adolescents. So the or is important here. And I'm interested in, let's do parent support. Parent support. And you can see that the database itself is already giving me some options. So I'm going to do parent support or parent involvement. That seems important and very related to parent support, or parent attitude or caregiver support. And that's not all of my what's yet, right? I'm interested in mental health. So I clicked on this plus. It gave me another text box. I'm going to put in here depression. I'm going to look at what it offers me as options. It's got depression and anxiety, depression in adolescence, depression or anxiety. I'm going to click on depression or anxiety because I know just from my own due diligence and studies that often those two things aren't correlated. And I'm not done yet, right? Because I want to search for just a quantitative article. I'm going to tell the algorithm not to include qualitative. I'll just put qualitative. And also not to include mixed methods. I just want a quantitative article. Then I go up here. I choose my databases. Academic Search Complete has been chosen. I'm also going to choose some of the other ones that Andy Tucker had listed on that page as really good ones. So I'm thinking of, for example, Medline is a good one because sometimes health-related things like depression and anxiety are published in medical databases. They're published in journals that then appear in medical databases. I'm going to go to APA Psych Info, APA Psych Articles, and Soc Index with full text. Okay, and I think that's okay. Oh, what happened here? Why did it get rid of? All right, well, it got rid of my search term, so maybe do your databases first. All right, Latino adolescents or Hispanic adolescents and, I misspelled that. Okay, Hispanic adolescents, there we go. And we said parent support, or parent involvement or parent attitude or caregiver support, plus we said depression or anxiety, down here. And then we said not qualitative, and also not mixed methods. Okay, now we're ready to search. So we're going to search and we're waiting. Okay. And okay, so pulled up about 2,260 results and showing us 50 at a time. Up here, you can ask it to sort by newest or relevance. Let's go ahead and do relevance. All right. Recall that one of the requirements is that the journal be peer reviewed. So we'll click on this. You also want to have the full text available because you're going to need that for your article summary later on. And you want this article to be current, to be from the last 10 years. So see here on the left where it says from 1988 to 2022, you're going to change that to 2012. And you don't want any magazines, you just want academic journals. So you're going to update and just double check. Yes, 2012. Okay, great. So now your results went from 2,200 to 637, which is good, right? And you just need one. So then you can look at the titles. A qualitative descriptive study. Nope. You don't want qualitative, right? So that one's out. I don't know why it pulled it up because we said not qualitative, but at least now you know that you don't want that one. Protective mechanisms for depression among racial ethnic minority youth, empirical findings, issues, and recommendation. Well, minority youth can mean a lot of different ethnic groups. So if you look here, it looks like yes, they include Hispanic adolescents or Hispanic youth, but maybe that one is comparative, comparing Hispanic youth, Latino youth to other groups, and maybe that's not what you want. So you keep going. Parental immigrant status and adolescent mental health in the United States. Do racial ethnic differences exist? So that might be a good one too. This one with an MRI. That one may not be specific to depression or anxiety. Here's one, Latino adolescents academic trajectory. So there's a lot of different choices. Let's go ahead and click on one and see predictors of self-esteem among Mexican immigrant adolescents and examination of well-being. Okay, so let's see if they talk here about parents at all. A little bit, right? Family conflict, acculturation. So I'm just going to click on this one, and I'm going to read the abstract. So before I open up the entire article, I want to read the abstract to see is it indeed a quantitative empirical article. So the abstract reads, relatively few studies have examined the construct of self-esteem among Mexican immigrant adolescents in the U.S., and most studies have focused on the independent influence of variables as opposed to adopting an ecological perspective. The present study examined individual, familial, and societal predictors associated with the self-esteem of Mexican immigrant youth. The study also examined the moderator effects of bilingualism, family cohesion, and parent-adolescent conflict on the relationship between perceived societal discrimination and Mexican immigrants' adolescent self-esteem. Hierarchical linear regression analysis, which sounds really scary because it's a lot of words, but that is a statistical technique that can only be done on quantitative data. So this would already meet the requirement for a quantitative article. Okay. So this kind of analysis were conducted drawing data from wave 2 of the Children's Immigrants Longitudinal Study. So this would be a secondary analysis, and it looks like it meets the requirements. But I'm going to go look at another one. So that one might be a good one to explore. Let me look at one of the first ones we encountered. Not the first one because that's qualitative, but let's look at protective mechanisms for depression. So if we click on this, okay, so it's got the word empirical, but sometimes that indicates that they're doing a review. So let's read the abstract and find out. Oh, look at this. We review empirical studies. So this would not be an empirical article. This would be a literature review. This would be what we talked about earlier, where the researchers go into a database, they identify 50 or 100 articles that all talk about Hispanic adolescents, depression, and then they compare the findings of each. So good article does not meet our criteria. So number 1 is out, number 2 is out. Parental immigrant status and adolescent mental health in the United States. Do racial ethnic differences exist? Let's read the abstract for this. Aims to examine the relationship between mental health problems and parental immigrant status in a representative sample of U.S. adolescents. Method, we analyzed the 2007 national survey, restricted to 32,849 adolescents. Parents or guardians on random. Random digit dial samples were interviewed by telephone about one of their children selected at random. 5 mental health issues were used: prior medical diagnosis of depression, anxiety, behavioral problems, etc. It included adolescents with immigrant parents, and it includes white, Black, and Hispanic adolescents. Okay, and here it tells you a little bit about the results. Decreased odds of behavioral problems. OR is a statistical notation that means odd ratios 0.35. P is less than 0.00. So even if you don't know what this means, the fact that you see numbers here indicates that the analysis was quantitative. They measured these things: depression, anxiety, parent support, for example, using some kind of quantifiable scale. So what would you do next? Let's say you want to use this article. Go back up here on the left. It's got PDF full text. Find it at TWU. I'm just going to click on the PDF. I have one more thing to check. So here it's opening up. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm trying to make my views smaller. And then I'm going to go find the methods section. There's my introduction. There's my method. Starts by talking about the data. It's probably really small on your screen, huh? Okay, so here it talks about, let me make it a little bit bigger. Method, data. We employed excellent data from the 2007 nationally NSCH. It tells you again how they sampled the participants and how many adolescents met the age and race ethnicity inclusion criteria. And here are the measures, the way they collected the data. 5 mental and psychological health measures were used. Depression, anxiety, behavior problems, parent reports of the adolescent feeling inferior, episodes of being withdrawn from others. And here it's going to tell you how it was measured. So depression, anxiety, and behavioral problems were determined by affirmative, meaning yes or no, to the following questionnaire items. Has a doctor or health professional ever told you that your child has any of the following conditions? So you would say yes, no, or don't know. And then those responses, yes, no, or don't know, would get coded as like a 1, a 0, that sort of thing. And if you're still not sure if this is, I'm actually going to download it so you can see it a little bit bigger here. And just put it on my desktop. Save. Oh, let's go ahead and let's do Latina. This might be easier. Okay, so we were down in the methods section. We're going to go to the results or the analytic strategy. That's helpful too. And here they're telling you descriptive statistics. If you see the word statistics can only be run on quantitative data. You can't run statistics on qualitative data. It's a whole different analytic approach. It tells you what kind of statistical analysis they use. So that will tell you it's quantitative. If you're still not sure, you could go to the results and look at that. They're reporting numbers, right? They're giving you percentages, more percentages. There's a table 1 that's got means and percentage distribution. So all of this points to, yes, this is indeed a quantitative article. Okay, I know that this video probably seems really long. It was definitely a little longer than I had intended. I'm going to go back to, I'm going to go back to here. Back to here. But if you have any questions on whether or not your article meets the criteria for the selection of your quantitative article or later on your qualitative article, please know that you can always reach out. You can email me. You can, before the deadline, you can send me your article and say, I really like this article. I'm not 100% sure it's empirical. What do you think? And I'll let you know. All right. Thank you.